When Walt Disney began his journey into animation, he quickly climbed up the ranks to become the #1 cartoon producer in Hollywood. Not only was he able to become very successful in one of America's toughest economic times, but he also did so by pushing the medium of animation to heights never reached before. Rather it be with his creation of Mickey Mouse, his experiments with the Silly Symphony cartoons, or by making the first American animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Yes, the 1930s certainly was when Walt was established as an entertainment icon. But once 1940 came in, that's when things really went downhill fast. When he released both Pinocchio and Fantasia during that year, they were both very well received by critics and audiences, and they both would go on to become cinematic masterpieces in their own right. However, when they first came out, there was one massive problem with them. He lost a lot of money on both. So at that point, Walt had to produce something cheap and fast in order to make up for the losses of his previous features. The result? Dumbo.
It's the story of a baby elephant named Dumbo, whom upon being delivered by the stork to his mother in the circus, was discovered to have massive ears, even bigger than his whole body. While he may have been ridiculed for his ears by both the circus audience and the other elephants, a mouse named Timothy befriends Dumbo and aids him to turn his humiliation into triumph that can make him fly. Quite literally, in fact. Just like with Pinocchio, the idea came to Walt in late 1939 when one of his employees, this time the head of merchandise licensing, Kay Kamen, showed him a prototype of a toy called Rola Book. It was like a children's book, but instead of flipping the pages, kids would have to roll the wheels to read the story like a scroll. In it was a story called Dumbo by the couple Helen Aberson Mayer and Harold Pearl, and Walt saw the strong potential to adapt it into animation. It was originally just going to be a Silly Symphony short, but it was then decided to be a feature so that the story could be told better. That, and considering the serious financial troubles caused by the downfall of Pinocchio and Fantasia, the simplicity of the story would help to have this be a low-budget film. Once he settled to have Dumbo be his next movie, Walt gave the writing duties to Joe Grant and Dick Huemer, who were not only in charge of adapting the story, but to also add new scenes and change up a few things. Like a Red Robin character that would help Dumbo on his journey was replaced by the mouse we know today as Timothy. The way the duo wrote the story for Walt was often noted to be as unique as Dumbo's ears, where instead of just giving him a whole script, they wrote the movie in chapters and only handed them over one by one while ending them off with an emotionally engaging cliffhanger. A weird strategy to keep teasing Walt to have him approve of their draft, but hey, it did work. Among the cast, Dumbo is noted to be the first movie to include a couple of actors that would later become Disney veterans that would provide the voice of many beloved characters in later films. They include Sterling Holloway, the voice of Mr. Stork, and later the voice of Adult Flower, the Cheshire Cat, Winnie the Pooh, Caw, Rockford, and the narrator of several cartoons, and Verna Felton, the voice of the Elephant Matriarch, and later the voice of the Fairy Godmother, the Queen of Hearts, Aunt Sarah, Flora, Queen Leia, and Winifred. On a side note, Sterling was originally considered by Disney to voice Sleepy in Snow White, but the role was ultimately played by the voice of Goofy and Grumpy, Pinto Colvin. Unlike the other films, where it was driven by Walt's passion to achieve a high level of art in animation, the biggest goal for Dumbo was to make it as cost-effective as possible. While many of Disney's top animators that also pioneered the modern way of developing the medium were working on the film to ensure it still has that Disney quality, new techniques also had to be invented to ensure that it can save the company money and stay true to the movie's simplicity. That, and little to no changes were demanded from the original draft, so the production stayed true to the script since the very beginning. However, some of the same old techniques were still used for the film, like having animal studies and using live-action references, where they hired the Jackson brothers to suggest some dances for the Crow's musical number, When I See an Elephant Fly. So far, things were going well with the making of Dumbo. Costs were kept low, production was running smoothly, nothing seems like it could go wrong. That was until May 29th, 1941. when the animators went on strike. Ever since Disney built the new studio in Burbank, the atmosphere among the artists drastically changed. A hierarchy system gradually enveloped in the studio where those at the top, like the head writers and lead animators, had better services, access to leisurely rooms, and received an amazing salary, while the lower tier people worked in secluded spaces, had to follow strict policies, and received little pay. After the failure of the 1940 films, the system became even worse, where the benefits and working conditions became completely unbalanced, on top of several workers getting laid off. One of whom was considered as one of Disney's top animators, Art Babbitt, noticed the unfairness among all the artists and ultimately decided to join the Screen Cartoonists Guild, where he demanded that the Disney studio would get unionized. Walt, however, did not see any issues with the class distinctions and refused to let the studio be a part of any union. This, of course, did not go well with the artists, and a war within the company began. Hundreds of animators joined Babbitt's side to become unionized and picketed outside the studio, which even received help from Disney's competitors like Leon Schlesinger of Warner Brothers. What was worse was the tension between Walt and Art as they grew to become arch-enemies, and they never had a good relationship to begin with. It even got to the point that an actual brawl occurred while they were picketing. As a way to artistically get back at them, the strikers were satirized in Dumbo as the circus clowns who want to go and hit the big boss for a raise. It wouldn't be until 5 weeks later when Disney finally signed a union contract, but the damage of the studio was already done. What was once an animation powerhouse that had around 1,200 employees now steadily lost nearly half of them, including some of their best artists and animators like Babbitt, T.He, Bill Melendez, Maurice Noble, Frank Tashlin, Bill Teitla, and Tyrus Wong. But the biggest consequence was that the strike left Walt with a permanent psychological scar. It was already enough that he was discouraged by Pinocchio and Fantasia's failure, but now the strike made Walt lose a lot of his trust with his own animators, and that spark for animation was no longer as strong as it was during the days of Mickey Mouse and Snow White. That, and he developed a paranoia-like fear of communism, and claimed that was mainly to blame for the strike. While it did delay a bit of the movie's production, Dumbo was finally complete and released on October 31st, 1941, and it was the success that Disney needed. On a budget of between $850,000 and $950,000, the film made over $1.3 million, giving the company some profit for the first time since Snow White. As for critics and audiences, they loved it as much as Disney's more expensive features, falling in love with the humor, the songs, the animation, and especially the heart. It won an Academy Award for Best Original Score and got nominated for Best Original Song for Baby Mine. Dumbo almost got its chance to be on the cover of Time magazine and be named Mammal of the Year, but because of the Pearl Harbor attack that occurred that year, his cover spot was taken by Admiral Yamamoto. However, not everything about Dumbo flew high and pretty after its release. The film had often been regarded as a subject of controversy because of the crow characters. Some accused them of being racist for being depicted as African-American stereotypes, and how the leader of the Crows, played by the white actor and voice of Jiminy Cricket Cliff Edwards, is very awkwardly named Jim Crow. On the other hand, many have also stepped in to deny these claims, stating that while Jim may be voiced by a white guy, the rest of the Crows' voices were black, and the way they are depicted in the film are not as stereotypes, but rather as free spirits and a smart group of birds that know how to give Dumbo the confidence to fly. In 1955, the film became the inspiration of one of Disney's most popular attractions, Dumbo the Flying Elephant, which now can be found at every Disney park, and the train Casey Jr. also appeared in the parks as a ride at Disneyland and Disneyland Paris, and as a float for the Main Street Electrical Parade. In 1985, a live-action puppet series aired on the Disney Channel called Dumbo Circus, which featured Dumbo running his own circus with his new animal friends that ran for one whole year. In 2017, the movie was added to the National Film Registry, and 2 years later, Disney released a live-action remake, or more of a reimagining, directed by Tim Burton and starring Colin Farrell, Danny DeVito, Eva Green, and Michael Keaton. The result became quite the opposite of the animated feature. Where the 1941 film was short, simple, had a small budget, beloved by the public, and was a hit for Disney, the remake was nearly twice as long, overly complicated, got mixed reactions, over-budgeted at $170 million, and ended up as a box office flop. While it may be a lot simpler than Disney's previous films, it is also the reason why many to this day state that Dumbo is simply perfect. While Dumbo only took around 1.5 years to make thanks to its simplicity, the next movie was artistically the opposite of what the elephant achieved, as it was realistically complex and took the studio several years to produce. That film was Bambi, based on the 1923 novel Bambi, A Life in the Woods by Felix Salten. The movie presents the life of a deer named Bambi from his birth all the way up to his adulthood. During his time in the forest, while he is the next to become the Great Prince, he spends his time discovering the world around him and playing with his friends like a rabbit named Thumper and a skunk named Flower. However, during his time growing up, he also goes through some hardships, especially when man is in the forest. But no matter how old he is, he always learns from either his mother or friend Owl about life, death, and love. It all began when in 1933, a certain filmmaker got their hands on the book and was inspired to turn it into a feature film. And we all know who this man is, right? It was none other than Sidney Franklin, the producer and director at MGM. He wanted to create a live-action adaptation of Bambi, but after trying some test footage, he realized that the camera could never do justice to tell this story. Then suddenly, he had an idea to make the best out of this novel. Maybe you couldn't film an adaptation, but you could certainly draw it, and at the time, there was no better person who could make better animations than the artists at Disney. So in 1937, Franklin sold the film rights of the book to Walt, and he immediately sprang into action to make Bambi his next animated feature. In fact, he originally wanted Bambi to be his second movie. However, as soon as he got into it, there were several obstacles that even his crew weren't ready to take on. There was the tone of the book being a little too dark compared to the light-hearted standards that Disney was known for, other productions like Pinocchio and Fantasia took bigger priority to make, and the artists were not trained enough to realistically animate forest animals like deer. Sure, they drew some for Snow White, but the focus on capturing realism there was entirely on the humans, while the animals still looked more like cartoons than something believable. It wouldn't be until 1939 when production officially began, but only at a steady pace while the company was handling other projects. Many different characters were proposed for this movie, but a lot of them either had their roles cut down or never appeared in the finished film. There was Thumper's dad, who was supposed to appear, along with Thumper's siblings having a role as prominent as his, a chipmunk and a squirrel that were a comedic duo, and some insects like ants, grasshoppers, and bees that would have brought more life to the forest. But eventually, they were all taken out because they didn't give much to the story, or Walt and the writing team wanted to keep the focus onto Bambi, Thumper, and Flower. But even when the film has those lighthearted and charmingly funny moments, there is one scene in particular that the public to this day often first associates with this movie. Originally, the film would have shown Bambi's mother getting shot, but then the writers felt that considering the scene's job was to establish that she died, it would have been emotionally too much. It was already enough that the scene said that she's dead, but actually seeing her dead?
I can't stand it any longer!
There was also a payback scene by the end where the hunter would have been shown being burned to death by the fire he caused. But that was taken out in favor of not showing the hunter at all and only referring to him as
Man was in the forest.
But even without seeing any bodies, the scene to this day is still regarded as one of the most powerful and heartbreaking moments in cinema. It was even noted to be the inspiration for Beatles member Paul McCartney to have an interest in animal rights. Like with Snow White, the biggest goal for the animation was to capture realism, but this time, the artist wanted to bring animals and nature to life in a way that is more down to earth than what they did in Snow White and Fantasia. The animators spent a lot of their time researching and studying animal anatomy and how they move, even bringing a little zoo in the studio to look at the animals firsthand. Once they knew how to draw the anatomy, there was still something that was missing. Yes, they could now draw a real deer, but for Bambi, it is still an animated film. The characters still had to talk and convey human emotion if it wanted to connect with audiences, and it had to have a design that could present that convincingly. This was when animator Mark Davis stepped in and drew Bambi's face as if it were expressing the emotions of a human baby, and Milt Kahl was the one that made the final design that combined the artist's anatomy studies with Mark's faces to create the iconic deer we know today. As for the backgrounds with the forest, that actually had less emphasis on realism. Instead of trying to make it look real, the artist wanted to make it feel real, which was why the environment around Bambi is more reminiscent to Impressionist paintings. The reason for this was because of Tyrus Wong, whose concepts and artworks made him the art director of the feature and was the inspiration for the movie's style. While it may have taken Walt 6 years to make the feature since he first got the film rights, Bambi was finally completed and got released on August 21st, 1942. However, the results did not come out strong, neither financially nor even critically. The film received mixed reviews where critics were put off by the lack of fantasy that Disney was renowned for in his movies and cartoons. It didn't help either that it was receiving complaints from hunters who accused the film of making them look like villains. As for the box office, while not as much of a failure as the 1940 films, it only made $1.64 million with a $1.7 million budget. This time, World War II was a bigger factor to this than ever, not only due to some of the international markets closed off, but also America got involved with the war since the attack on Pearl Harbor. It put the film in the middle of a blazing fire with what was seemingly no way out. But just like in Bambi's case, the fire eventually subsided to breathe new life to the movie. As time moved on, the criticisms gradually turned into praise as critics now call it one of Disney's crowning achievements in animation. And with the re-releases gathering newfound audiences long after the war, the film ended up receiving more than $267 million. There was even a Donald Duck cartoon in 1955 where Bambi and his mother made a cameo.
The hunter's natural instinct helps him blaze a trail.
Man is in the forest. Let's dig out.
After its initial release, Bambi temporarily became an icon for the United States Forest Service and appeared in campaigns for fire prevention. However, Disney only let them have him for a year, which resulted the Forest Service to later create their own fire prevention mascot with Smokey Bear. But it wouldn't be the only time he would collaborate with the USFS though. Over the years, Bambi and Smokey often collaborated in public service announcements to tell people that
only you can prevent wildfires.
It got selected to be in the National Film Registry in 2011, and the American Film Institute put the movie on a couple of their lists, including number 20 on their top 100 villains with Man, and at number 3 on their top 10 animated films. While it may be commonplace in many lists of the best animated features and best movies, what could arguably be the strangest list that featured Bambi was in 2007, when Time put the film on its top 25 horror movies of all time. A list that includes Many may consider it to be one of the greatest coming-of-age stories in movies, but not many people know that the movie itself went through a coming-of-age story that's equally as great. Guess there's a good reason why this is Walt's personal favorite movie he made, huh? With the financial failure of Bambi, the patterns of the studio's recent flops were no longer just a mere coincidence. While part of the blame could be pointed towards going over budget, They all suffered from many of the European and Asian markets shutting their doors due to World War II. And as I said before, even America started to get into the action after the events of Pearl Harbor. So now with everyone involved, it wouldn't take too long for the company to find itself in the middle of all this and get drafted. And thus, the Disney Studios went to war. Their first duty actually started in early 1941 during the development of Dumbo, where Walt and 18 of his trusted employees were sent by the United States Department of State to go on a goodwill tour across South America with Disney as their ambassador. It was very beneficial for both the country and the studio. It was good for the United States so that their relations with the Latin American countries remained strong and not have them switch over to the Nazi Germany side, and it was good for Disney because it gave Walt a form of escape from the strike so that it could be resolved by the time he returned. But while they were partly treating it like a 3-month vacation, it was also an opportunity for the team to do research and create 2 animated features that highlight South American culture, since those could also play a role in the goodwill operation and have the government fund them. These include 1942's Saludos Amigos and 1944's The Three Caballeros. After the release of Bambi, the studio quickly converted into a military base, housing over 500 soldiers, while some of the artists were sent off becoming soldiers to fight in the war. Also, since the company was restricted by the banks to only produce animated shorts during the war while the features they had in development were all put on hold, almost all the content Disney put out at the time was for the military, including the 1943 film Victory Through Air Power. While it still may give the studio some work during World War II, it didn't really help them that much financially, since at best the animated projects broke even. Once the war was over, it didn't take long to see how the world completely changed because of those events, even in the animation field. Disney was no longer secure at the top of the cartoon industry, as tougher competition began to emerge, getting attention away from Mickey Mouse like Warner Brothers and MGM. And what's worse, the Disney Studios was still left low on cash, unable to produce the animated features they wanted to make. While they were still able to create more shorts with Mickey, Goofy, Donald, and more, the company had to look for more cost-effective ways for their bigger projects, including experimenting with non-animated films where Walt began a nature documentary series called True Life Adventures, starting with 1948's Oscar-winning Seal Island. They were still able to produce movies, but they had to be live-action films that featured animated characters in their own cartoon segments or blended in with the real environments, including 1946's Song of the South and 1948's So Dear to My Heart. As for animated features, all Disney could do was projects that share the same template as Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, and produce what is referred to as package films, which is a collection of animated shorts packaged together and release them all in one shot as a feature film, including 1946's Make Mine Music and 1948's Melody Time. However, 2 of these package films would later stand out among the rest and would be viewed as iconic as some of the actual Disney movies. One of them, released in 1947, was Fun and Fancy Free. The film features 2 different stories, with the first being Bongo. Introduced by Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio and narrated by Dinah Shore, it's about a circus bear named Bongo who breaks out to live free in the forest, which did not turn out to be as great as he thought. That is until he falls in love with a girl bear named Lulubelle, where the only thing that's standing in Bongo's way for romance is a giant bear who also has hearts for Lulubelle named Lumpjaw. The other story of the feature, narrated by Edgar Bergen, is Mickey and the Beanstalk, where in Happy Valley, the town fell into complete turmoil and poverty due to the singing harp being stolen. 3 of the residents, Mickey, Goofy, and Donald, traded their cow for magic beans, which at night grew into a giant beanstalk and brought the whole house up to a massive castle, which has the singing harp. Now it's up to the gang to rescue the harp to save their town and escape the wrath of the giant named Willie. Originally, for both stories, they were meant to be their own separate features. Starting off with Bongo, the project was based on a short story found in the Cosmopolitan in 1930 by Sinclair Lewis. When the Disney team had their hands on the project, they had many different ideas of what to do with Bongo that ultimately never came into fruition. One of these was to make this a sequel to Dumbo, where some of the characters from the film would have also made an appearance. At the same time, new characters would have aided Bongo on his adventures, including a chimpanzee that was called either Beverly or Chimpy, along with 2 mischievous bear cubs. However, those plans ultimately never came to be. The characters also had a more realistic design, but was also dropped in favor of a cartoonier look. When bringing back Jiminy Cricket, along with his original voice actor, Cliff Edwards, he also brought with him the song I'm a Happy-Go-Lucky Fellow, which was originally meant for Pinocchio, but ultimately got cut. Meanwhile, as the animators were performing their Circus Bear act, another group was developing Mickey's next big adventure. Animators Bill Cottrell and T. Heath thought up of a film adaptation of the classic fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk, but starring Mickey Mouse with Goofy and Donald Duck by his side. The pitch was great, and even Walt enjoyed it, but not enough to seriously turn it into a movie. It took some time to talk him into it, but they ultimately convinced Disney to make it, and production began on May 2nd, 1940 under the title The Legend of Happy Valley. Funny enough, it wouldn't be the first time that Mickey had to fight against a giant. He famously took down one in 1938's Brave Little Tailor, and even before that, Mickey starred in a cartoon that was a loose adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk in 1933's Giantland. However, while this wasn't Mickey's first encounter with giants, this was one of the last times that Walt provided the voice of Mickey. Disney had been the voice ever since the mouse first had sound in Steamboat Willie. But later on, he had less time and his smoking was weakening his body to the point that he could no longer do the job. So in 1948, after Fun and Fancy Free's release, Walt passed the baton onto the head of sound effects Jimmy MacDonald to be Mickey's new voice and continued the legacy until 1977. But there was one instance afterwards when Walt returned as Mickey in the late 1950s for the Mickey Mouse Club.
Hi, Musketeers.
Hi, Mickey!
Well, here we go again. So hang on. Anything goes. You ready?
I don't know about you, but this does a better job than any commercial can to tell me that I should never smoke. Originally, there was supposed to be a scene where the mouse was shown trading the cow for magic beans, and there were a few versions of it, but it ultimately never happened. One idea was to have Honest John and Gideon from Pinocchio con him into trading for the beans, while another that was far into development was Mickey giving the cow to the Queen, played by Minnie, where she then rewards him with her family heirloom of magic beans. Unlike Bongo, this project would end up receiving several versions, each with a different narrator telling the story. The original had ventriloquist Edgar Bergen in live-action segments tell the story to child actress Luana Patton at her birthday party, with the assistance of his dummies Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd. When the Beanstalk grew into television, the second version had narrations by Sterling Holloway in 1955. The third featured Ludwig von Drake alongside Herman the Boodle Beetle in 1963. And finally, the fourth had Sherry Lewis and Lamb Chop in 1973 for the TV show The Mouse Factory. By that time, both projects were going well into production, but then at the end of 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was when everything was put to a halt. It wouldn't be until after the war when they brought those projects back. But due to the need to cut down costs and that Walt didn't feel like either stories would be strong enough to stand as their own features, he decided to scale them down to bring out both Bongo and The Legend of Happy Valley, now called Mickey and the Beanstalk, together as a package film. When the movie was released on September 27, 1947, the critics felt rather mixed. While generally agreed to be mediocre, at best they said that it was okay, but still nowhere in the leagues of something like Snow White or Pinocchio. As for the box office, it did gather some money with $3.165 million in worldwide rentals. As I've stated before, the two segments would go on to have numerous airings on television, especially Mickey and the Beanstalk and all of its different narrators. In fact, it became one of the most well-known adaptations of the fairy tale, and Willie would go on to appear in several different Disney projects with Mickey. His most famous appearance after his theatrical debut was in 1983, where he played as the Ghost of Christmas Present in Mickey's Christmas Carol. While it may just be one of Disney's small package films, it was a little opportunity for the team to just go and make something full of fun and fancy-free. The other notable movie during that time was also the last of the package films of the 1940s, known as the 1949 feature, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Both based on classic works of literature, the first story is The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Narrated by Basil Rathbone, it tells the tale of Mr. Toad, whose obsession with fads often get him in a lot of trouble, especially when he quickly developed a mania for motor cars. When one incident left him in prison and lost his deed to Toad Hall, it's up to his friends Ratty, Molly, and Angus MacBadger to save him and prove his innocence. The second story is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Narrated by Bing Crosby, it's about Ichabod Crane, the new schoolmaster of a small town in New York called Sleepy Hollow. During a Halloween party, he learns about the legend of the Headless Horseman, an evil spirit whom every Halloween night returns from the dead in search of a new head to take as his own. But when it's time to head back home, Ichabod discovers firsthand to see if the legends are true. The idea all started way back in 1938, after the release of Snow White, where storyman James Bordrero and animator Campbell Grant pitched to Walt a film adaptation of The Wind in the Willows. Since it's a story that mainly features anthropomorphic animals, the only way one could properly adapt it into a movie at the time was with animation. Disney was skeptical at first, but then got the rights not long after in order to turn it into a feature film. Production was pretty rough by the early 1940s, even when under the directing guide of James Alger. But it did pick up a bit when the team that made Bambi came in to help out as that film was finishing up, and the new project began animation. But like what happened with Fun and Fancy Free, by the end of 1941, the studio was put to a halt and temporarily had to stop its production on feature films. However, there is one thing about it that I have yet to mention. While the studios had to be restricted to making shorts, the only exceptions to this rule are the movies that were far into production so that they could be finished like Bambi. And since The Wind in the Willows already started its animation process, it was allowed to continue during the war. Too bad that it didn't last long though, since Walt decided to scrap the project because he felt like the quality of the picture was far from the standards of his previous films like Snow White or Fantasia. It wouldn't be until years later in 1946 when the project returned. But now with the new mindset of producing package films, Walt demanded that The Wind in the Willows be shortened to just 25 minutes. Meanwhile, later in that same year, Disney began production on a new adaptation, this time with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with Clyde Geronimi and Jack Kinney as directors. At the time, it was a good subject for the studio to take on, not only because of its popularity, but also because it was a short story from Washington Irving's The Sketchbook, making it a perfect choice to add it into one of Disney's package films. Once the cartoons were set up, the only challenge at that point was to know which of them should be put together, especially in the case of the shorts from this film and Fun and Fancy Free. Originally, The Wind in the Willows was meant to be paired up with Mickey and the Beanstalk for a feature called Two Fabulous Characters. But then it was ultimately decided to have Mickey appear with Bongo for their own feature. As for The Wind in the Willows, it eventually paired up with Sleepy Hollow and have the title changed to The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. When it was released on October 5th, 1949, the film received stronger praise than Fun and Fancy Free, saying that they were aware that they're not fully faithful to their respective source material, but still admired the high energy and great narration that showed that Disney still had some magic from before the war. It even managed to win a Golden Globe Award for Best Cinematography in Color. Afterwards, the fabulous characters would split ways to form their own legacy in the world of Disney, airing on television and even returning to theaters as their own shorts before the main feature film would begin. In the case of The Wind in the Willows, it was the inspiration for one of Disneyland's opening day attractions, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and some of the characters would later return in new roles in the 1983 short film Mickey's Christmas Carol. As for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the cartoon became a staple in many of Disney's Halloween TV specials, while the Headless Horseman himself became a tradition at the Disney parks as he leads the Halloween-themed nighttime parades. Oh, I almost forgot about the box office numbers. While Ichabod and Mr. Toad may have critically surpassed Fun and Fancy Free, it financially only made about half as much with $1.625 million in worldwide rentals, which highlighted a problem not just with this movie, but with the package films in general. Sure, at best, they can be a bit profitable, but economically, it's like if the studio was going nowhere by playing it safe with them and getting a bit of extra cash from the reissues of the older movies. At that point, Walt knew that if he wanted to take back the top spot of the animation industry, he needed another Snow White. He needed to make another full-length animated feature where he and his animation team would give it everything they got, and once again put his entire studio and legacy at risk. He got all of his money, he got all the right people to make a movie, but all he needed was the right story that could perfectly fit the glass slipper.